Dr. O'Reilly, would you like to welcome Sarah Gershman?
Yes. Well, thanks everyone for joining this YPS webinar. We're really excited tonight to have Sarah Gershman, who's the president of Green Room Speakers, and who is going to be speaking to us tonight on a topic called How to Speak with Presence. Ms. Gershman is a renowned public speaker and speaking training, and this really is a pretty interesting and awesome opportunity for us. So, Ms. Gershman, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to begin tonight with a story, actually, about the performer Carly Simon. So she looks like she's having a great time up there singing, but in truth, she actually suffers from tremendous stage fright. And in fact, she gets so worked up before she has to get on stage that she does something very interesting, which I want you to think about. She has someone come right up to her each time and give her a big slap on the face. So I want you to think about why she would do that. You know, what is she doing? Is she distracting herself from the fear of being up there? Is she moving from perhaps a flight mode to a fight mode? There's really one word that sums up this attempt that she's making, and that word is presence. So what Carly Simon is doing is she's getting out of the non-present mode. In other words, she's getting out of the past, out of the future, and she's actually putting herself smack into the present moment. So when you are anxious before, let's say you're giving a presentation or you're having a difficult conversation, and you're nervous and you know you're not present, you're always going to be in one of two places, right? You're going to be stuck in the past and you're thinking about maybe an experience that didn't go well, or you're thinking about all the things you didn't do to prepare you for that moment. And the other place you're going to be is the future. You're going to be thinking about what the reaction's going to be, will they like you? And all of these thoughts prevent you from having presence with your audience. So a lot of times people will tell me, oh, I could never really be a great speaker because I'm not charismatic. And I want to draw a distinction between presence and charisma. So presence is the ability to be fully in the moment and present with the people that you're talking to and with the information that you are giving, the message you're giving. And charisma, on the other hand, is this sort of ineffable quality where the energy is all drawn towards you. You know when someone is charismatic, they walk into the room and everyone's focused on them. So I believe that ultimately presence is a far more valuable skill to cultivate than charisma. And it's something everyone can learn, and you don't have to get slapped on the face to do it. So tonight we're going to talk about 3 types of presence. The first is called presence of self, and that's how to get present in your state right before you get up to speak. It doesn't have anything to do with your content or your delivery, but it has to do with the state that your mind and body are in. Second, we're going to talk about presence of message, how to be present in your content. And finally, how to be present in your delivery, how to make sure that your voice and your body language make your message stick with your audience. As you can see, there are 3 types of presence, and I'm a big believer in the rule of 3, that the mind remembers things in 3s much more than any other number. So you'll see that we'll do a lot of things in 3s. As we move into presence of self, I want you just to think for a moment that when you've seen presentations of any sort, but especially in your field, what have you seen that hasn't worked? Okay, so think about that for a moment, and then we'll come back to that. Presence of self. So wherever you are, whether, most likely you're sitting down listening to this, I'd like to do a quick exercise with you right now. I'd like you to imagine that you're about to give a very important presentation. But here's the bad news. You're feeling terrible. You're feeling just sick. You're feeling depressed. You're feeling anxious, all the worst feelings. Right now, in your chair, I'd like you to get your body into its worst possible state. So what do I mean by that? I want you to do this with me right now and feel how exaggerated and terrible it is, okay? So we're going to slouch our shoulders. I want you to lean over your desk, perhaps cross your arms, clench your fists, have your breathing be really shallow, look down, all the way down. And now, with your body as closed and slouched and tight as possible, when I count to 3 to yourself out loud, I want you to say good evening. Okay, so let's do this. 1, 2, 3. Good evening. Now, you can come back up and sit up straight. It is almost impossible to sound confident, to sound enthusiastic, to sound present when your body is in your worst state. Why in the world would we do this? We never would get our bodies into their worst state right before we speak. But the truth is that we do this all the time and we don't even realize it. Because when you're stuck in thinking about, again, the past and the future and you're not in the moment, your body takes on some of that, whether it's a clenched fist, whether it's in your eye contact or your breathing. And then your body sends your brain a message that that's how you're feeling, and then that's how you sound. So I realize I'm talking to physicians, and this concept is quite obvious, that the body has this influence on the mind. But when we're about to speak in public, it's something we often forget. So now let's do the opposite. Let's get our bodies into what I call your optimum state. So you're about to give that presentation, and this time you're feeling fantastic. So what's your body doing right now? So if you can, stand up, and I'd like you to get your body into its best state. So your feet are grounded, your knees are relaxed, your posture's open, your arms are probably at your sides, you're looking straight ahead at the people you're talking to, and your breathing is nice and relaxed. In this state, try now to say good evening when I count to 3. 1, 2, 3. Good evening. So, it is very difficult to actually sound nervous and anxious when your body is in your optimum state. It is just a small, it takes 15, 30 seconds, a small exercise that you can do that, again, has nothing to do with how prepared you are, how much you know, or what a good speaker you are, but really gives you an important edge as you step into the room. So now, and I'll be taking questions at the end, but feel free to write in some questions as we move through these. We're going to now move on to presence of message. And for this, I want to now tell you a story that was told by this woman. She is the late writer Nora Ephron. She tells a story about an assignment that she was given in her 7th grade journalism class. And I'd like you now to do the assignment with the class. Okay, so, imagine how you would do the assignment. The teacher said to the class, I would like you to write the lead for an article for the student newspaper. I'm going to give you some information. Take that information and use it to write the lead for the article, okay, for the student paper. So here's the information. All right, you ready? On Thursday, the entire faculty of the Beverly Hills High School will take a trip, first by plane, then by bus, up to our state capital, Sacramento, California, where they will listen to a first-time lecture given by the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead. So all the students, wrote their leads and handed them in. And it turned out they had pretty much all said the same thing. They had all reversed the information and started with Margaret Mead. Why? Clearly, because she's the most famous part of the story. So they said Margaret Mead will be speaking to the faculty, etc. He took their leads, he ripped them up, and he threw them in the garbage. And he said, "This is your lead. On Thursday, there will be no school." Now, there may be some of you out there who maybe you figured that out, but I do this exercise over and over again, and very, very few people get to there is no school. And, so you can think, okay, well, what lesson is the teacher trying to impart? And clearly the teacher's trying to explain to them that you need to know your audience. But we know that. We know we need to know our audience. The more interesting question is, why doesn't anyone get it? Why don't you get to there is no school? And what I hear over and over again from my clients is that because you get stuck in the information that I gave you, and it's hard to get outside that information. And that's something that we call the curse of knowledge. And it's a phrase that was coined by the brothers Chip and Dan Heath in the book Made to Stick, which I highly recommend. It's called Made to Stick. And what the curse of knowledge is, they do an exercise where they have half the people leave the room and the other half they have stay in the room, and they say, your partner's going to come back. See if you can knock on the table, happy birthday, and get your partner to recognize it. Everyone says, oh, I can totally do that. So everyone comes back in the room, and the people start knocking on the table. And what do you think happens? Nobody gets it. Nobody gets it. That's the curse of knowledge. When you know something, it is very difficult to imagine what it's like not to know it. If you know it's happy birthday, of course it's happy birthday. But if you don't know it's happy birthday, it sounds like random knocks. And so when you are an expert in something, which each of you on this call tonight is an expert, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But your expertise comes with a liability. The more information you have, the harder it is to get to there is no school. I gave you just enough information to be able to make that difficult. But had I given you more information, it would have been even more difficult. So we need to get to there is no school. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to think about a presentation, or it could even be a presentation to one person, something that you either have coming up or that you'd like to give in the future. Maybe it's something you've done before, something in a professional capacity. And I'd like you to think for a moment, who is your audience? So if you want to get to there is no school, so to speak, you have to start with thinking about who is your audience. And I'll give you a little secret about your audience, and this is true for any audience. Every audience always comes into the room with two needs. They have a spoken need, which is what they would say if you went around the room and asked them why they were there. But they also have an unspoken need. The unspoken need is the thing that they wouldn't say, but it's really what's driving their participation. It's the unspoken need. So an example of an example of a spoken need is, I'm here to learn more about public speaking. I'm here to improve my presentation skills. An example of an unspoken need is, I'm here because I don't want to fail. Or I'm here to impress my colleagues. Or I'm here because I have to be here. If you can take a guess at what the unspoken need is, you're going to have a much more effective way of addressing the audience. So write that down. Think about who your audience is right now, and just jot down a couple of details about them, so we have a specific audience in mind. So we're not just talking to the board of a hospital, or we're not just talking to patients, but we're talking to a specific group of people. Write down who they are and what could be the spoken need and the unspoken need of the audience. Not your need, it's the audience's need. Okay. So now that we've taken a couple of minutes to think about the audience, let's move on to the message. So for this, I'd like to now tell a story about my son. About 6 years ago, we were walking along a pier in Santa Barbara, California, and we looked down and we saw this big, beautiful starfish. And my son happened to ask me a great question. He said, actually, let me just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Obviously, what he had been learning in school, that a starfish, its unique power is to regenerate its arms. And so he said to me, "Can people do that?" And I had to say to him, unfortunately, we don't have that ability. But because I'm always thinking about speaking and communication, it occurred to me that yes, we do have that ability. And this is what I mean. The starfish has a disc at the center of its body, and that disc contains all of the information it needs in order to be able to grow back an arm. As long as that disc is intact, it can regenerate. If that disc gets damaged, it loses its ability. It's the same thing with a presentation. As long as your central disc, what I call your core message, is intact, then if something goes wrong, like let's say if you lose your train of thought, or if the slides don't work, or if someone throws you a curveball question, or someone's cell phone goes off, a million things can go wrong. You just go back to your core message and you can regenerate. So it's hard to get the core message really precise and accurate. But actually, sometimes when I'm working with my coaching clients, we'll spend hours on this. But once you get it right, everything is easier. It's easier to write the presentation. It's easier to structure it. It's easier to deliver it. You deliver it much better on your own. And it's also much easier, again, to bounce back when something goes wrong. When I started my company, Green Room Speakers, I have a theater background, and I thought I was helping people with their delivery, right? So I'm helping them speak more clearly and not to speak as fast and use the right body language, etc. But what I soon discovered is that the number one reason why people fail to speak as effectively as they actually are able to has nothing to do with what good speakers they are. It has to do with the clarity of their core message. And that once this gets clarified and really made precise, everything gets better. So let's start. So there's 3 questions that comprise the core message, and I want to do this together now. The first question, what do you want them to know? What is the one thing that you want your audience to know from your presentation? This is probably the hardest one because you have 100 things that you need them to know. And this question asks you to prioritize them. If they come away learning one piece of information of all the things you're going to tell them, what's the one that's the most important to you? And then everything will flow from there. So this is not the title of your presentation. The one thing I want you to know is not how to be a better speaker, right? It's what is the one thing that I want you to know in order so that you will become a better speaker. Okay, so then take a minute right now and try to jot that down. Maybe you could even write down 3 things and then circle the one that's the most important. So again, this question is all about prioritization. It's overcoming that curse of knowledge by choosing that one thing and having everything flow from it. Okay, let's move on. The next question, how do you want them to feel? People will remember much more how they felt when they listened to you, when they had an experience, than any of the information that they learned. You want to have an emotional intent for the audience. They're going to feel something. Regardless of what you do, they're going to leave your presentation feeling something. What do you want that feeling to be? Do you want them to feel inspired? Do you want them to feel empowered? Do you want them to feel challenged? Do you want them to feel excited? Each of those are different. Try to pick one. What is the one feeling that you want to leave them with? Next, what do you want them to do? So if in the feel question you answered, I want them to feel informed, try to change that because informed is not an emotion. Likewise, I believe there's never any such thing as a strictly informative presentation. There's always a change that you want the audience to make. One of the most powerful ideas that I ever heard about public speaking and presentations was said by a woman named Nancy Duarte, who said that we always make the mistake of thinking that the speaker is the hero of the presentation. It makes sense, right? The speaker is the one who's up there, who's the star. So, of course, if there had to be a hero of a presentation, it would be the speaker. In reality, it's not the speaker, right? It's the audience. And why? Well, if you think about any story that has a hero in it, what makes the hero a hero is that the hero changes over the course of the story. So take The Lion King, for example. Simba in The Lion King is the hero because Simba goes from running away from his problems and from his life to having the courage to confront them, right? Likewise, your job as the speaker is to help your audience make a change, to help them make the change you want them to help them move from point A to point B so they really are the hero. And this actually takes a lot of the pressure off of you. One of the reasons why we get so anxious and nervous when we get up to speak is that we're so worried about what everyone thinks of us. We're programmed to experience speaking that way. The eyes are all on you. Everyone's judging you. And in reality, it's not about you. It's about the audience, and it's about how they can change from the beginning of the presentation to the end. So now back to our third question. What do you want your audience to do after you speak? What precisely do you want them to do? It could even be to change their perspective on something, or it could be a specific action. But write it down. What do you want them to do? So to review, your core mission or message. I like the word mission because when you feel like you have a mission going into a presentation, then you don't have time to be nervous. You know, when you're performing an operation, of course, you're not focused. I mean, this sounds so obvious, right? You're not thinking about what the patient's thinking of you and how they're judging you and are they going to think you're a good doctor. No, that's crazy. Of course, you're there to do a job. You know what the job is, and you're there to do it. And as a result, you probably don't get anxious when you're doing it. But when we get up to speak, we're so focused on what everyone's thinking about us that we forget that it should be the same thing. You should have a mission when you get up to speak as well. And so define your core mission. What do you want the audience to know? How do you want them to feel? And what do you want them to do? What you see in front of you is the space shuttle. And the space shuttle had all of these rocket boosters that it launched with that would help it launch into outer space, and then they would drop down. And that's the way you can think about the beginning of any presentation. So now we've defined the core message. Now we're talking a little bit about how to deliver that presentation. That you want to begin with something that's going to make the audience sit up and listen, and not just something that's, like a really fabulous statistic or story or joke that's entertaining and that's going to get them excited about the presentation. You have to go beyond that. You want to have a beginning that's actually going to launch the presentation so that the audience is able to then focus immediately on the task at hand. So now we're going to move on to presence of delivery. We talked about presence of self and presence of message. And here we have a study that was done at UCLA. And the study measured what happens when people hear contradicting information. So let's say you hear really good news in a very sad voice. Right? Like you hear something like, everybody in this room is going to get a 15% pay raise. Okay? What do you believe? Or you hear really bad news in very upbeat voice or body language. And someone stands up and they're really excited and they say, guess what? Everybody is going to get a 15% pay cut. What do you believe? Turns out, only 7% of the people believe the words. 38% believe the voice, the tone, the modulation, the pauses, and 55% of the people believe the body movements. So what does this tell us? Does it mean that the words don't matter? On the contrary, I believe that the words are everything. But if the delivery, if the voice and the body don't match the words, that's where we have a problem, and that's where the words don't make the impact. So your job as a speaker is not to be some fabulous elocutionist. Your job is pretty simple. You've got to make sure that your voice and your body match with your content. That's your job. So let's start with that 38%. Let's start with the word, with the voice. The key to engaging an audience with your voice is contrast. The ear needs to hear contrast, and the ear tunes out when there's a monotone. That's why you can be listening to NPR for an hour and stay engaged, because they are constantly changing it up. They're changing the male and female voices. They're using sound effects. They're using music. And you get bored after a minute of hearing a speech because it's in a monotone. So you can think of your voice as having these dials on it, 4 dials. And the first dial is the volume dial. So these are dials that you're always wanting to turn up and down. And again, I really want to stress that when you have a clear message and your content is solid, you're going to do a lot of this stuff on your own. Your voice modulates very naturally by itself. You don't have to work so hard at this, but you can always tweak it. You can always get better. So first there's the volume dial. You want to vary the softs and the louds of your voice as you're presenting. So you want to punch certain words that you want to emphasize and contrast the moments where you're quieter with the moments where you're louder. The second dial, tempo. I bet if you're like most people, you probably think that you tend to speak too quickly. And I would venture to say that the problem most likely is not that the tempo of your voice is too fast, but it's that your eyes are moving too quickly. So when your eyes dart back and forth while you're speaking, which is very natural, then people experience that as rushing. When you're varying the tempo of your voice, you want to have contrast between the parts where you're building the speed and you're, maybe telling a story about something and it's getting faster, with the parts where you slow down and where you stop. The ability to use silence in a presentation is invaluable. After all, silence is really what we're most afraid of. The worst thing you can imagine is getting up to speak and you just blank and you just sit there in silence. But if you can pause purposefully, then you have the audience. We make a mistake of wanting to somehow fill the room with noise out of fear of that, awkward pause. But if you notice, when you've seen someone who knows how to use silence, everybody pays attention during the silence. The learning happens during the silence. So try to pause. Next, pitch. You also want to vary the highs and lows of your voice. We can think of this also in terms of color, that we sometimes get into the cooler tones of our voice when we're presenting. By cooler tones, I mean like the blues and the greens. And I'm doing this right now, where I'm speaking in my upper register, and I'm speaking sort of in a very matter-of-fact way, and my voice is getting a little bit higher. And what I want to do is I want to contrast that with the warmer tones in my voice, with the reds and the browns. And to contrast, that right now my voice is coming from a deeper place in my diaphragm, and to contrast the highs and lows. Finally, tone. And by tone, I mean the emotional tone. So the time in your presentation where people are most likely to get lost is in the transitions. So just as an example, you could be talking about a problem, and you use, let's say, if you're trying to use some sort of expression while you're talking, you sound frustrated when you're talking about the problem. There's just something in our system that's not working, and it's really frustrating, and we need to fix it, and the way we're going to fix it is da-da-da-da. And you forgot to switch tones from the problem to the solution, and as a result, the brain gets stuck on the problem and misses the solution. So the key here is to change tones with your content. So you can divide your presentation into a series of these mini tones. Like, for example, you might start out, you want the audience to feel curious about something. Then you want them to feel upset and frustrated that something is not working out. Later on, you want them to feel hopeful that there is a solution for this. And at the end, you want them to feel empowered to go out and make that solution happen. So you can hear in my voice, I've switched tones each time. Now, a little bit about virtual presentations. Because clearly this is one. And when you're giving a virtual presentation and you can't see me and I can't see you, it's very challenging because you miss the eye contact, you miss the body language, and really all you have is your voice. So my main advice to giving a virtual presentation like a conference call is the following. Try to channel your voice like a laser into the phone. We have a tendency when we're speaking on a conference call to want to speak out into the ether. You don't really know who's listening to you in the first place, and your voice just kind of goes out. What you want to do instead is imagine you're speaking to one person and one person only, and try to channel your voice into the phone as if you were talking to just one person. The goal here is that each person listening to you should feel as though you were having a one-on-one conversation just with them. So that's voice. And now let's talk a little bit about how to have presence of body. That's that 55%. So we'll just talk about a few things here. And the first is movement. Two things about movement. One is that movement is directly connected to your status in the room. The more you move, particularly if your movements are somewhat random, the more you move, the lower your status is. You can think of a lion who's very still versus a mouse who's scurrying around. So if, let's say, you're having a conversation with somebody and you want to be the authority in the room, you want to raise your status, try speaking with your head still. But, of course, you want to use movement. Movement is very powerful, which leads me to my second point about movement, which is that movement needs to be purposeful in order to work. And it really is very powerful if it's purposeful. So remember we said to change tones when you're making a transition? Movement is also a great thing to use when you're making a transition. So if you're saying point A, you might walk a couple of feet to the left to then move on to point B. And that movement that you make helps the brain transition from point A to point B. So purposeful movement. Next, visuals. The first thing about visuals is that they are for your audience. They are to help your audience learn. And if they don't do that, then you don't need them. They are not for you. They're not to keep you on track. They're not to be a script for you. They're to help your audience learn. So that's the first thing. The second thing about visuals is that they are never going to be the star of your presentation. It's always going to be you that's ultimately going to influence the room, not your slides. So don't let them overpower you. Keep them simple. Don't have things on the slides that you don't address. And you could always give people a more detailed deck afterward, but keep your visuals very simple. So that's visuals. Finally, eyes. And this connects to a principle of public speaking that may sound surprising, but I think is actually very helpful, which is that actually this whole thing that we're talking about, public speaking, this whole, what this webinar is supposedly about, is actually a myth. There is no such thing as public speaking. And I'll get to how this connects to eyes in a moment. So again, we have this idea that speaking is a scary thing because all the eyes are on us. And we are programmed to experience it that way. In reality, you are not listening to me right now as a group. You are listening to me as individuals. Each one of you is hearing me in your own way. And if you were in the room with me, you would be watching me and listening to me in your own way. And so the best way that I can speak to you, just like I talked about channeling my voice like a laser, the best way that I can try to make each one of you feel as though you were having a one-on-one conversation with me, were you in the room, is using my eyes. So what you do is you look at one person at a time, one person per thought, and have sustained eye contact with that person and then move on to the next person. This takes practice because we're used to scanning the room. We all do this. But once you can get it, it actually relieves a lot of the anxiety because you're no longer speaking to a group of 20 people. You're having a one-on-one conversation with each person in the room, one person at a time. Okay? So again, you're having a one-on-one conversation instead of speaking to 50 people. That's the mentality that you actually want to get at when you're in front of a group to have the most impact on the group as a whole, to speak to them one person at a time. Okay, so let's review. So we talked about presence of self and getting into your optimum state, okay, when you speak. We then talked about presence of message, defining your audience, the spoken, the unspoken needs, and developing your core message. And finally, presence of delivery, making sure that your voice and your body language match your content. Now, before we take questions, I just want to end with one piece of advice. This actually is not my ending, so you'll see this in a second. The last piece of advice I want to give you is not to end a presentation on Q&A. So you're thinking, oh, well, every presentation ends on Q&A. And actually, it's a bad idea. Why? Because when you end on Q&A, you're ending on someone else's question. No matter how good their question is, it can't possibly be as good as your ending. You have no opportunity to reinforce your message, and you're leaving them, the presentation will kind of peter out when you do that. So my recommendation is either take questions throughout or do Q&A second to last and save something for the end. So now I want to just open the floor for any questions, and I'm happy to take any, and then I'm just going to take a moment to close.
The conference has been muted. The conference has been unmuted.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for the talk. I think it was really it was great, and I'm actually giving a ground round next week, so I took a ton of notes. But I want to ask, if you feel yourself losing this concept of presence, like mid-talk, often I feel myself like 20 minutes in, I lose stream. How do you recommend like a cue to get back on track to these ideas?
That's a great question. So what I hear you saying is that it's easy to have presence, let's say, at the beginning when you start, but then if you're speaking for a while, you can kind of like go into a mode where you're not fully present, right? And how do you get back on track? So I think that one thing that I would recommend is throughout the presentation to just get back into that optimum state. And in addition, when you have a very clear roadmap and you know why you're moving from point A to point B to point C and like where sort of making the presentation feel like a single narrative, it's easier not to get lost. If it becomes like sort of a random list of things that you're trying to get across, you're more likely to lose presence. But if you can make your presentation, again, feel like a single narrative, it's going to be easier to stay in that narrative.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Hi, Sarah. It's Aviva. First of all, thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Oh, my pleasure.
I do have a question for you also. I know you talked a lot at the beginning of your talk about trying to identify what somebody wants to get from you, how they want to feel. When you're in a situation where you're not entirely sure what that is, how do you go about identifying it?
Well, can you speak a little bit more, thank you, can you speak a little bit more about where the uncertainty comes from?
Well, I think this talk is also interesting because it applies to when plastic surgeons speak in public, but I think it also really applies to when we speak to patients. And they say that like patients only retain like 5% of any individual patient encounter. And often specifically like in cosmetic surgery, there's a lot of, there's a surgical proposal that happens. We propose something to a patient and they come in for, let's say, a breast augmentation. And, you go over a surgery proposal with them and you're essentially trying to sell them something. And I think a very important part of that is also kind of trying to figure out what they actually want. What their need is from you and what they want to hear. Is financing an issue? That sort of a thing. And I think sometimes it's hard to identify what the patient's looking for. And so I was wondering if you had any advice on that.
So I think that you don't need to have that answer in order to get at how you want them to feel. For example, if let's say there could be any number of things that they're looking for, and you're not sure which one it is, you may want them to feel something like feel heard or feel understood or feel validated. So any of those things can open the door for you to then discover what it is that they actually need, if that makes sense. So the emotion doesn't have to be the thing that they want. It's more what you decide that you want them to feel at the end of the encounter with you.
Got it. That's helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
Sarah, this was an excellent talk. Thank you so much. Do you have any tips for dealing with a hostile audience?
Yes, thank you. And I would say that ironically, the main tip that I would give for dealing with a hostile audience is whenever possible to keep the bond. That when somebody seems like they're attacking you and breaking the relationship, breaking the bond, if you can keep that bond and get it back on track, it's far more effective than joining them in the attack. So one way to do that is by reframing a subjective question and turning it into an objective question. So if, let's say, they're asking a question about your practice in a very attacking way, to turn that into an objective question about a particular skill that they're talking about that has nothing to do with you, and answering the question in that way. This is obviously a much longer discussion, but that's just a place to start. Okay, so please also, if anyone has further questions, feel free to send me an email, or you can figure out how to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to answer more questions. But I wanted to go back to that idea that I said towards the beginning of the presentation of thinking about the mission of your speech and sort of what a revolutionary idea this is. Again, because I feel like whenever I speak to a group of doctors, I feel like this is so obvious when it comes to medicine, that here when you're actually performing an operation on a patient, there's so much more at stake, right? And it's so much more complicated than any presentation could possibly be. And yet there is a fear of public speaking, and you don't hear about that as much when it comes to doing things as difficult as performing surgery. And again, to think about why that is, and to take the lessons from the medical world and apply them to public speaking, in the sense that when you can identify your mission in your presentation, whether you are speaking to a patient, whether you're giving a sort of larger presentation in your field, when you can identify that mission and you can own that mission, your anxiety is just going to resolve itself, because it's no longer going to be about you, it's going to be about them, and it's going to be about serving your audience. And there's really no greater remedy for anxiety than identifying the mission and sticking to it in your presentation. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with each of you.
The conference has been unmuted.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining the YPS webinar. It was great. Thank you, Sarah. It was awesome, and we really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.